appreciate it. So I'm President and CEO of Anavex Life Sciences. We focus on rare diseases and also degenerative diseases. And today I like to focus on developmental diseases, specifically rare diseases. And I like to cover the challenges, opportunities in running clinical trials for rare diseases.
Great.
So next slide, please. So first of all, what is a rare disease? It's really defined by the different regions in the US, in Europe, in Japan, which are major places where the definition has been defined. And that's basically, in a nutshell, those which don't have enough patients to motivate a sponsor to run clinical trials. So it's an average in the region of less than 200,000 patients. And in Japan, it's a bit less than that. Next slide, please. So rare diseases are really not as rare because there are so many of them. There are 7,000 that makes up industry in itself. And that's what we're talking about. That is very attractive for sponsors to investigate rare diseases, to find treatments for patients which have a very small footprint in the disease features, and that what makes it attractive also for us to move forward with rare disease development, but also for many other sponsors. Next slide, please. As you can see, that what is really a clear picture is that rare diseases are originated by the genetic deficit of a patient since birth. And that's why the majority of the diseases are actually diseases of children. And the vast majority of rare diseases, however, have not yet found a place where you can claim there's a treatment available, so they still remain untapped. Next slide, please. As you can see, though, over the period of the last several years, there's been a very stark increase in rare disease designations. That means that has been picked up the notion that there could be treatments available because this rare disease designation requires data to be provided to the agencies, and they have to acknowledge that this data is validated. And the fact that we see an increase shows that there's hope for patients with rare disease for potential treatments going forward. Next slide, please. And as you now can see in the sale picture of worldwide sales of orphan designations, you see an uptick as well. So not only did the orphan designation has ramped up, but also the actual sale, and for that you can call it, is now became a major industry in the previously considered niche field of rare diseases, where it's quite attractive actually that to be involved in finding treatment options for rare diseases. And that very nicely shows in this graph where the worldwide orphan drug sales have increased significantly, as well as the share of prescription drug in the overall market. Next slide, please. So how do you move forward with a rare disease program? It's actually not that different from a normal indication or indication not being a rare disease. You have to find still treatment validated models. You have to advance that in the toxicology. You have to then advance proof of concept in a clinical trial. And then you have to do larger studies, and then you have to go to the regulatory bodies to get it approved, and then you can market it. Next slide, please. One thing, though, is different is in rare diseases, there is a incentive to develop these diseases because the agencies are giving you potential incentives in form of fast track designation, breakthrough designation, accelerated approval, and priority review. And that's very attractive for being able to bring a drug faster to market than a non-rare disease. Next slide, please. And these features are a little bit more detailed in this slide. I don't want to go into detail, but the message is that The communication with the agencies improved. You can talk to them any day. Usually you have to wait 30 days before you get an answer. The other thing is that you get a drug to market with accelerated approval, which would require, in other cases, more restrictive requirements. So overall, it's really, truly an incentive, and I think it's important to be aware of that. Next slide, please. So what is really important also is that these incentives, though are given, still a lot of, I would say, reality challenges remain for rare diseases. And this is where I want to start the discussion about the challenges. Next slide, please. So there is really by necessity to run clinical trials. And by definition, because they're rare diseases, there also are less patients available. And that makes it challenging for recruiting patients and enroll patients with the proper sample size. Because the statistics still have to be confirmed that a drug is better than placebo. There are some exceptions that you can run an open label, but that might be only an exception for very, very rare diseases, which are called ultra-rare diseases. But in combination with the fact that there are less patients available to recruit, there's also a dilemma that the indications often have different phenotype stages. So they have interpatient or individual differences. And if you have that in the trial, you will not be able to often find a signal, although the patient has the disease, because it doesn't advance or improve as you expect because of the heterogeneity of the population you're treating in your trial. So this has to be now considered because you have a diminished power. Next slide, please. For that reason, it's important to be aware of that and do rigorous planning and address these operational challenges, like this dispersed population, which are not only rare, but they are all over the place, literally, and they're not centered in one area geographically. You also have to consider that the experience of running clinical trials in a population with a rare disease is not often the case. So it's often you run into the first study with such a rare disease, and there's no experienced physician to assess the endpoints, and also the trial participants are not well, knowledgeable about how to proceed and what to do, and so you have to educate, and you have put in more effort to educate sites and the community to do that successfully. Next slide, please. So to go back, what are the trial designs? They're really the same in a rare disease. You have to have a sample size, you have to define the endpoints, you get to regulatory submission to prove this, you select the sites, you have patient recruitment, and you have to collect the data properly and manage the funds for the trial cost. But what's important is that overall the education really takes a major part, and for that reason we really suggest the following. And let's start in the next slide, please. So we think in order to succeed in a rare disease trial, it's very important to have a valid scientific hypothesis that you can demonstrate that that's why you should run a clinical trial. And that convince a lot of stakeholders, not only the patients, but also the key opinion leaders and the authorities. Then you need a really very feasible protocol, something which the patient can deal with, can proceed with. And then you also have to have what I believe a very motivated investigator group and site staff, because they really run the trial for you, and you're left basically on their you have to put the responsibility on their shoulders to execute. And last but not least, you have to also have motivated patients, because they are the ones who actually are required for clinical trials. And all of that, in my belief, brings to the forefront what is called the patient advocacy groups. And on the next slide, I elaborate a little bit more about that. So collaboration, we believe, is really the key success for such a clinical trial. Next slide, please. So that's why, because the focus is on the patient, what we really noticed is that the most important thing is to have a very robust, collaboration with your key stakeholders, which is the patient's advocacy groups, among other things. Next slide, please. And this will take care of many things. You have to be able to communicate, for example, the travel arrangements. Often patients are not mobile and they have to be taken care of on that. It's much more difficult to make a travel arrangement to a site if somebody is not mobile and needs a wheelchair compared to somebody who isn't. And a lot of intrinsic factors in a trial can be smoothly communicated and managed in this very strong collaboration and focus on the advice and involvement of the patient advocacy groups. Next slide, please. And ultimately, really the focus remains, if you look at it from a global perspective, on the patients, because they're the ones who's going to come or not come to your trial. Next slide, please. So here is really the key message I like to convey: the integration of the advocacy group and the key opinion leaders very early in this process, which will really be important for being able to work closely with the community to also get a significant recruitment addressed, and also to get the trial successful to a finish line. Next slide, please. So again, the collaboration with all participants, and I really want to highlight especially again the involvement very early on the patient's advocacy group. Next slide, please. And the key thing is to really be able to find a CRO which is really able to execute, because the CRO will eventually be the forefront, the face of your trial. And if you have a poor choice, you made a poor choice, it will be detrimental to your study. That's what's important, to have a very good relationship and a strong, engaged CRO. And we're lucky we had that all the time so far. Next slide, please. What is also important, and that's really novel, is that what we did, we not only executed the trial, but also we added additional measures of intelligence to run the trial, to learn from it while we did the trial, and that included using artificial intelligence and modeling to improve the outcome of the study success. Next slide, please. What is also important and novel, and since COVID, was really the ability to integrate digital solutions, remote assessment. We're really fortunate that when we did the trial, the one I'm talking about in a minute, in Rett syndrome, we really integrated very early on the chance and the opportunity to have the assessment made remotely at home for patients who are impaired. In Rett syndrome, patients are impaired to travel. Next slide, please. And this is where I like to now focus on briefly on the case study which we did, the rare disease indication of Rett syndrome. Next slide, please. So our focus is really on Rett syndrome, and on not only Rett syndrome, but other rare diseases. You can see that in the pipeline. We're covering also Fragile X, other diseases which are in the autism spectrum disorder, like Angelman syndrome and infantile spasm. But really the most advanced rare disease drug we are focused on right now is Rett syndrome. Next slide, please. What is Rett syndrome? Rett syndrome is really a disease which is by birth, and it cannot be prevented by genetic screening because the mutation, which is in one amino acid called MACP2, is actually a spontaneous mutation. So you can never test the parents before birth or birth planning, family planning, if they have any risk genes, because it doesn't show up. It's a spontaneous mutation of that gene, and that leads to the outcome which are described here. You see the picture says more than 1,000 words. There's no interaction, not even looking in the eye. They are immobile, they're wheelchair bound, they cannot speak often. they have high anxiety levels, they have seizures, and there are around about 11,000 patients in the US alone, same number in Europe, and same number again in Japan. And there's no cure and no treatment available as of today. Next slide, please. So we did this trial, a small trial in adult patients with Rett syndrome, which is really challenging because they're more advanced and since birth impaired, and they don't get better. And we did this over a period of 7 weeks, which is standard time for those indications. And we included the major endpoints, which the FDA also needs for considering approval of this study of this indication, which is the RSBQ, but also the CGI, which is Clinical Global Impression Improvement Score. We also included biomarkers and respective information, genetic information. Next slide, please. So this is the outcome of this data of this trial, which was a small study in an adult population, which is a handicap in itself, and also not a big study. And despite the fact we had really a nice outcome, both the RSBQ and the CGI were positive significantly, showing in this slide where the active arm performed much better than the placebo arm. What is also important on the next slide is that we had a very well-tolerated drug. Next slide, please. A very well-tolerated drug from a safety perspective. All study participants, in that case was 25 in the open label, in the placebo-controlled study, and 6 in the open label. They all continued the extension. They finished all the studies, and they've continued all in the voluntary extension, which is now running 36 weeks, and it's ongoing as we speak. But also the adverse events were very minimal. There were no serious adverse event and comparable adverse events to placebo. Next slide, please. We're also intrigued about the fact that in the study we had a biomarker of response identified, and we will release this further this quarter to make sure people also appreciate the integrity and the fidelity of this trial and the drug working really very specifically and well with the patients of this disease. Also, we have the ability to confirm the mode of action, which is restoring homeostasis in the cellular system. And it also gives us comfort, given that we have now indications of similar disease fashion like Fragile X, where we also receive very good preclinical data input, and that allows us to also expand the indication base beyond Rett syndrome with this therapeutic intervention, which is called Anavex 273. Next slide, please. So in summary, really, what I'm left to say is that the clinical development of rare diseases is usually challenging and difficult because of the facts I stated. However, it's extremely rewarding. And it's the most rewarding is to see the faces of the parents with their treatments which have received benefit after having not even had a chance for finding any alternatives. Also, the success is really residing on the collaboration across the different stakeholders. And I like to again point out the advocacy group as one of the key elements. And we really were able to have a very extremely strong dialogue with the key opinion, with the advocacy group of Rett syndrome, where we have regular calls and meetings, and we really are very connected on all bases throughout the trials and actually beyond. Then also it's important to focus on the patients because they are the ones you need for the trial, and they're the ones you're doing the trial for. So this it should be self-explanatory. Also, it's important to work out something to have patients to be retained in the study, and that's why an open label extension after the placebo-controlled study is a very advantageous thing, and we did include that in our trial. And last but not least, it's really important to appreciate the bigger goods for this. It's to really find treatment options for these patients who have no way to go, and that makes it really rewarding to do that in that regard. And again, the collaboration with all parties involved, especially the patient advocacy group, is extremely important. Next slide, please. So with that, I'd like to leave you and just summarize that we are really trying to aim for patients treatments which are an unmet need, especially the rare disease, which are catastrophic diseases. But we also have, for your information, indications covering with the same drug, which are more well understood, like well known, like Alzheimer's disease, dementia, Parkinson's disease. And that's something which is intriguing, that we found a ability to address also those diseases, and we have clinical data confirming that. We are really happy to move forward and expand the rare disease field. But again, my summary is plan ahead, well ahead, and surround you with the best people, because people will drive the success, and ultimately reward is really the faces of the participants with these diseases, which are really have for that reason considered orphan, because they're really being neglected and there's no treatment available for them. With that, I'd like to thank you, and I'm open for a few questions.
Thank you very much, Christopher. Again, maybe the audience is a little shy. I can certainly see they're in attendance based on the counts below the screen. But as I've done with previous speakers, I always think a dialogue is good at the end. And can you talk a little bit about the strategies you used to maintain rare disease patients in the clinical trials? What I mean by that, not only just offering an open label extension, but if you're going to find these patients and you have 25 of them, and I'm sure they're in the US, I'm guessing for this particular study, you might have, I'm going to say not 25 sites, but they're going to be scattered. And how do you facilitate their onboarding? Do you use some kind of decentralized approach? Do you take a white glove treatment to get the patients in the trial? Talk a little bit about the operational challenges and how you've met them.
Yeah. Before the study started, we met with the parents of these patients, and we basically designed, shared with them a synopsis of the clinical study and asked them, would that study be with the visits we had integrated in the design? Would it be feasible for you to execute and be part of? And the feedback was very strong. And the outcome of this feedback was we had too many visits in this design planned. And so we cut down on the number of visits because of the impairment from the travel challenges. And not only that, I learned from that feedback that there was a preference to not travel and getting out of the house. And that was way before COVID. And we included in this trial for that reason a option to also have the visit done outside of the US, outside of the home, and visit in the home. And that was the key for a successful recruitment during COVID. And maybe that was a contributing factor that all participants not only were recruited very quickly, but also stayed in the study, and were happy to join the extension study thereafter.
Well, yeah, that's terrific, and I'm sure other speakers and discussions about the decentralized option will come into vogue. What I also find interesting is that you're targeting, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, they're not rare diseases, but there's probably a subset of those that you're actually looking at where you're genomically pre-screening them, or am I not understanding that correctly? Because that's not a rare disease.
Right. No, this is a non-rare disease, actually the largest unmet CNS indications you can think of, right? 6 million in the US alone for Alzheimer and 1 million Parkinson. No, these are actually patients which are coming into the trial irrespective of the genetic background. What we just did, which was a pre-specified analysis of the genetic background of the sigma-1 receptor, which is the target of our drug. So we basically did the same also with the Rett syndrome study, which you just saw, and we're just finding out if the fidelity is true that the sigma-1 receptor wild type, which is the fully functional gene, is responding better for those patients versus those who have a mutation, and there's a minority who have a mutation. So we're talking about 5 to 10% maybe, but it's qualitatively important to see if that has an impact on the response. And that's what we found. So all patients are still better treated irrespective of their genetic background than placebo. But if you do a analysis of the genetic background of the treated patients versus placebo patients, then you see that those with the wild type sigma-1 gene, which is 90% of the population, are performing slightly better than those with the mini variant, which is only one amino acid. And that basically gives us confidence that the drug works exactly as we predict.
Great. So there's a couple of questions that did come in. One is what type of remote assessments were used? You mentioned they were allowed to, to stay home, if you will. How did you go ahead and assess those?
Yeah, so Zoom is really ubiquitous, and that was the widely used assessment to make the dialogue of the questionnaires with the RSBQ, which is the patient assessment, and the CGI, which is the physician assessment.
Great. And it looks like there's one other question about releasing data from the study this quarter. That's more of a, I don't know, is that more of a Wall Street question, or is that I'm not sure. Would you like to respond or not?
What is the question?
When do you expect to release data from the TIRLEST this quarter?
This quarter, yeah. So we're talking about latest end of June. This quarter, May or June.
Right. That part I don't know too well. Okay. Yeah. I don't see any other questions that are coming in from the audience. So again, thank you for your time. We're going to transition over to the next speaker, and I'm sure your slides are available on the corporate website and on our organization's
in the organization. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you again, Christopher. I very much enjoyed it. Okay. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Yep. And then we will be going to our next presentation, which is how to optimize your clinical study and budgeting for decentralized trials by Anka, CEO of Strategicon.